Okay, hi everyone. This is Jennifer Grady, founder of the Grady Firm, and I'm an employment and business attorney lawyer here in Southern California. And I am here with my esteemed colleague, Jenny Tran, who is a business and tax advising attorney. And we are here to talk about what you should do now that it is time to finally start returning to work. And so this is kind of exciting turn of events since we have been talking about layoffs and furloughs and PPP money for a long time. And it seems like hopefully there is a light at the end of the tunnel, at least a little bit and gradually as we start to reopen, or for people that have been open this whole time to make sure that you do have the right policies and procedures in place for us to get back to work. So just if you see, I'm going to share my screen a bit. Just to show you a little bit about myself. I founded the Grady Firm in 2012, and we work with entrepreneurs and business owners around the country and help as they grow with their employment, HR issues, and immigration. And you can contact us at the Grady Firm. We do immigration law, employment law, business law, and corporate law. And we have a shopping cart on our website, and you can also schedule an appointment with us there directly. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let Jenny share her screen, and she's going to go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks. Jennifer, can you see the slide deck?
I can.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. My name is Jenny Tran. I'm a senior business and tax planning attorney at Brown and Streza, and also adjunct professor at Loyola Law School. My services are general counsel, tax, and business planning services for business owners. And in the context of communication and service, my goal here is to provide business owners with a roadmap or issues for them to consider in reopening. And even if you have already reopened, it's still prudent and actually imperative for you to consider these 9 issues that I'm going to present for you today. I encourage you to just take the time to listen and think through the topics that we're going to talk about. After the presentation, what I will do is, as an additional resource to you, in addition to the video link that we're going to send out, I'm also going to email you the entire slide deck so that you can subsequently listen to this again and literally use the slide deck as a checklist for topics for you to consider and think through. Because right now I'd like you to just focus on the spread of topic to consider. And I hope that at the end of this, you would at least have a roadmap for your thought process for reopening your business, and also for going forward, how to further continue. You know, in the news, we've heard of restaurants who couldn't bear not opening and actually opened 2 weeks ago before they were even permitted to open. And we even see tweet of Elon Musk unilaterally deciding that he's going to open his factory to Alameda and that he's going to be on the front line. That's one aspect of considering how to reopen, but we'd encourage you to at least follow 9 specific issues to go over. The first is developing a business plan with your task force. And this is really going to be the foundational first step to your business reopening planning. And as a threshold issue, you should consider whether your business is legally able to open. And even if it is legally able to open, to what extent do you want to open it with the look towards how much revenue are you going to be able to capture with the phase of opening that you're willing to do in the scope of compliance. And in making this determination, it would be a good idea for you to actually create a reopening task force. partly because there's only so much that a business owner can do. But if you include your human resources, your in-house or outside general counsel, your IT department, facilities, and the related, I will say, service professionals, you would be able to have a collective perspective and know that these are the pitfalls or perspectives that you should take into consideration in determining how much of your business you should reopen and the impact on revenue. I want to make sure that you also consider communicating with outside third parties. You know, so much of what a business owner does is servicing customers, right? And also making sure that they're communicating with their suppliers. And if you have a lease in place, you might have either stopped actually operations, and now that you are intending to continue, what does that look like with the outside third parties? These are important individuals that you need to make sure that you stay in communication with, because they'll either impact the ability for you to collect revenue, impact your supply chain, or impact your expenditures or your liability with respect to insurance coverage. So again, when you create your business plan, remember to consider how much and to what extent do you want to open, who to include in your task force, and make sure that you're communicating your plan to outside third parties so that you can capture or minimize your revenue loss. The next issue that I would encourage you to consider is conducting a risk assessment and documenting that assessment. And this particular section, I've actually created a series of issues for business owners to consider. And earlier in my presentation, I mentioned, just take the time to listen and think a little bit about these issues. And then after the presentation, when we send you the checklist, take the time to sit down with whoever it is that you want to include in your task force and go over this. You want to first start off with examining whether your business was deemed an essential business and if you were conducting it at some level, either during the shutdown or not. And that would give you an idea of how much you want to reopen. Then you want to go into certain levels of regulations in determining your ability to reopen. So later on in the presentation, I will discuss with you the federal guidelines, the California state guidelines, Orange County guidelines, and even the city of Irvine has their own guidelines to consider. And you want to assign these variety of guidelines over to your task force for each individual task force owner to take ownership over that regulatory body in terms of compliance. You want to examine whether your business is retail customer facing or either in the production or manufacturing arena.
And Jenny, if we do have federal, state, and local regulations, and perhaps they are in conflict, what would you recommend about how to decide which one to follow?
Yeah. So in the spirit of compliance and also limiting liability, the business owner wants to have the perspective that all of the variety of agencies have jurisdiction over the business owner in one sense. And so the business owner probably wants to look at what is the strictest out of the variety of regulations and comply with that, because if they satisfy the most strict standard, then they likely have satisfied the other less strict standard as well. And not only that, but for them to pay attention to how that may change. In my discussion today, as I point out the variety of standards, what we'll realize is that there's actually a lot of deference given to the Center for Disease Control, partly because they have the expertise and the study. And so of the varieties of regulatory bodies, business owners really should be paying attention to that particular regulatory agency as well. Jennifer, let me know if should elaborate as I continue to discuss. So in
And just
further,
a thought on that. I have been always deferring to the CDC when I'm doing research for clients. They might say, for example, do we need to have masks in the workplace? And then you go to the CDC, and I have to say the information is pretty sparse. So sometimes I would look, for example, if the client's in LA at the LA County Public Health, they have their own directives, and it's like a 2-page PDF that you can download. So that is where you might want to look at the local as well. And I would say a lot of people are complaining about the masks. They don't want to do it, but we also have, number one, just being a good citizen and keeping people safe the best, least difficult way we know how. But also there is the potential liability, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But you are going to be responsible if there are outbreaks in the workplace. And so this is kind of one of the steps that you can take. So I think when in doubt, always take the more conservative method would be my recommendation in that regard.
great, great. So there's concurrence between your practice and my practice. And in continuing on what a business owner should consider in their risk assessment, when we're talking about face masks, the business owner should consider whether it's practical and financially able to provide safety measures for their employees, like face masks and hand sanitizers. In their risk assessment, business owners should consider whether their staff in particular, and for example, if they're in the retail space, whether the third parties, customers who come into their space have come into contact with someone who was positive and infectious with COVID-19. In the analysis, the business owner should consider the density of the workplace and what they can do to decrease the density as well.
And then about masks and equipment, generally, if you're requiring that of employees, you should be providing it. And if you do know that you're going to be bringing workers back in the future, or if they're already there now and it's going to take some time because of delays in supply chain, you might want to look into that now, seeing if you can, I know a lot of business owners are just going to all the different stores and trying to get wipes and masks there, ordering online. I just got an email today from Amazon that they have a whole segment
Oh,
dedicated to return to work um, personal protective equipment. So that's really that you should maybe have a task force uh, in that regard to always be looking about how you can get these things and keeping them supplied, because this is kind of like a constant thing and a lot of these things are disposable, so you need to keep that supply on hand.
right, right. And in analyzing the density of the workforce, the business owner should consider what percentage of the workforce is capable of teleworking or telecommuting, and perhaps keep those employees off-site so that they can show that they're not only creating a risk assessment, but actually taking affirmative steps in decreasing the density and lowering the risk of COVID-19 transmission. Um, and, and as the business owner goes over these topics, uh, they should literally sit down and document that they actually conducted this analysis. It doesn't require a full write-up, but that's part of why I said go ahead and listen, and then afterwards, when you have the PowerPoint presentation, even writing on this is the act of documenting the assessment as a place for you to start. The next roadmap issue that I would like a business owner to consider is really to be introspective and to consider what position do they want to take in terms of offering benefits and its compliance with legal obligations. Jennifer asked a really good question earlier, which is because of the variety of conflicting rules and regulations, what should a business owner do? And I first answered from a compliance perspective, always follow with the strictest rule. But on a compassionate perspective, is that what a business owner want to do? When offering benefits for voluntary leave, do they just want to comply with the law or actually take it a step further and offer more? With respect to training their employees, do they just want to follow the law and do the bare minimum, or take it a step further and make sure that the training is updated on a regular basis? When examining a business owner's legal obligation, they now have the obligation to implement individual control measures and screening for their employees. And they also now have to implement disinfecting protocols and also offer physical distancing guidelines.
Mhm.
You know, Jennifer, did you have something to add?
Sure. I was just going to say that since, as you all know, the laws are changing hourly, daily, weekly, litigation is going to come. We know that there's plaintiffs' attorneys that are always eager to bring lawsuits. And so it puts business owners in a difficult position where you're constantly trying to pivot every day. So the number one thing you can do is record things. Again, have your task force, have a safety captain who's going around to make sure these things are being implemented, take photos, and then have lots of policies and procedures written in terms of things you need to do, like cleaning, sanitizing, and rules for coming back to work. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if you haven't been a good record keeper, I know I kind of talk about this each time I do a presentation. Now's the time to start, whether it's you or someone else on your staff or someone you can outsource. That's, I would say, the number one thing that you're going to need to do. Is the burden seems to be on the employer, especially in California. So you want to always have a defense. And then knowing that these things are coming, start preparing offensively by having these policies, putting them in place, and don't just have them, make sure that they're followed, follow up on them. You need to change them as things evolve. So I know this is an extra category of things that you need to do while you're working, but it's more important now than ever.
Right. And so now we're going to take a deep breath and exhale because we went over a very dense level of topics, right? So business owners need to develop a plan, include your task force members in developing the plan, conduct and document that risk assessment, and figure out within the compliance part spectrum, how far do you want to go? So we're going to continue now with issue 4, which is what are the requirements for California reopening orders? Right now, we're still in stage 1, and hopefully we're going to lead into stage 2. And there's this nifty infographic that the state of California has issued. And what it means for stage 1 compliance is that retail, related logistics and manufacturing supporting retail, office workspaces, limited personal services, outdoor museums, and childcare have opened. And the idea behind phase 1 is really to be ready for safety and preparedness, hence the roadmap discussion that we're having with you today. With the requirements for being able to move on to stage 2 hinges on a business owner performing a detailed risk assessment and implementing a site-specific protection plan. And that's why I wanted to go over into detail earlier the variety of topics that you should consider in conducting the actual risk assessment. And when I talk to you about what is your moral compass with benefits and legal compliance, you know, the general encouragement from the state of California is actually to take a more aggressive measure to protect your employee health and actually at least comply with minimum safety and health standards. And earlier when I mentioned you want to make sure that you communicate with third parties in your reopening, you want to set expectations with your employees and customers once you determine at what phase you're going to be opening at. You know, I have to applaud retailers because not only have they been reaching out to clients with their brand message, they're doing a good job with giving updates on the opportunity for customers to spend money with them. And also to be flexible with your plans and protocols in anticipation of scale backs or closures in the future. When we examine how other countries who have progressed very well with the decline of COVID-19 infections, what you'll see is after reopening, they have had a peak in their curve, and as a result, they actually had to move back phases as well. And so you want to consider that as a potential risk. And unfortunately, the reopening measures does not mean this is going to be a grand reopening, but it's more of a ginger step reopening, and really anticipating what the rules, new rules can be issued. So in that regard, I encourage business owners to subscribe to the covid19.ca.gov website for California. And not only is it going to be helpful because new rules are going to be issued, but also because there's industry specific guidance on what phase reopening could look like for a business owner's specific industry. I'm not going to go over them all in detail in our discussion today, but I want to let you know that it's uh, actually relatively clear for business owners to be able to think, well, what enterprise are they in? And to be able to find guidance so that they can make a determination on what their requirements are for cleanliness and for warning customers potential risks. Not only are there California requirements for reopening, here in beautiful Orange County, there are actually additional guidance that Orange County has offered as well. Orange County defers to the Center for Disease Control, but they themselves have actually determined that we're ahead of the rest of the state of California. And Orange County believes that I say we because I'm a resident of Irvine in Orange County, California, that we're actually in the early phase of stage 2. And rather than focusing on what can be done, after the presentation, what I encourage you to do is pay attention to the light blue box about what is actually not permitted. And more specifically, certain personal services, I think that requires intimate contact, like nail salon and tattoo parlors, are not permitted to be open. Hospitality services are not permitted to be open, such as bars and wineries. Neither are entertainment venues, indoor museums, community centers. And I'm just going to go down to potential clients of ours, which are hotels and lodging for leisure and tourism for non-essential travel. Unfortunately, those are still not permitted in phase 2. And if we examine and sort of reflect how ahead Orange County is, we can kind of try to figure out what does the rest of the country look like. Next, I'm going to focus on federal reopening orders. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, partly because depending on your industry, these variety of regulatory bodies can apply differently to you. But I want business owners to know that the Center for Disease Control right now is the first and foremost controlling guidance in terms of health and safety standards. For labor and compliance, remember that there are Occupational Safety and Health Administration standards, the Department of Labor standards, and also standards set forth by the Equal Opportunity Commission for Labor. Jennifer, did you have anything to add?
Just requirements. We'll get into those in a second. Yeah, sure.
Okay. And since the Center for Disease Control has controlling guidance, I want to talk to you all about the current recommendation that's effective as of May 6th. The Center for Disease Control recommend that employers conduct daily health checks for its employees. It advises in business owners to conduct hazard assessments in the workplace. And they're encouraging business owners to encourage their employees to wear face coverings in the workplace if it's appropriate, and to actually implement policies for social distancing in the workplace. And to the extent possible, to even improve building ventilation systems. Because the Center for Disease Control can update their guidelines on a regular basis, I encourage business owners to also subscribe and to obtain more information. And I provided the link in the presentation. So these are the variety of regulatory bodies that the business owner needs to consider in their reopening. Fortunately, a lot of the collective message behind the regulatory bodies is about employee safety and how to prevent transmission of COVID-19 as their overarching theme. The next topic I'd like business owners to focus on is once they reopen, what does it look like for them to manage their employees, right? And it's here in the spirit of communication and collaboration that a business owner should, after creating their plan, communicate that plan to the employees. After determining who are essential and non-essential and who can or cannot telecommute, determining the timing and manner in which employee or worker can return. And once the employee returns, implement the health and safety standards and let the employee know that they have to comply. And even at an individual employee level, determine their suitability to return to work.
All right. So Jenny, do you want me to elaborate on these topics?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay,
I think this is
great.
Jennifer's area of expertise as a labor attorney.
Okay, so what I've been seeing, I would say over the last 2 weeks, our employers are still in the process of some layoffs, some furloughs, and other terminations. And so one thing I just do want to advise on that is if you are doing layoffs, clearly communicate the reason for it. I have seen some clients getting pushback from employees saying, well, some have been fortunate that it's not due to COVID that they're doing layoffs. And so they've pushed back on that and maybe asked for more severance. So I just want to recommend, if when you're going through this process, either when you're separating people from employment or bringing them back or deciding who to put on furlough, you want to make sure that this is done for a reasonable business decision and it's done in a fair way, not because you think someone is older than others or has potential disability, different things like that. We want to maybe make a chart that says the reason that we're making these selections. Look at training they've had, performance reviews, seniority, different things like that, and make it objective. That's the number one thing that you can do to prevent discrimination lawsuits or potential demands for labor claims from this issue. And I've already seen some of this arising. So that's like the number one thing I would to do there. And then in terms of communicating with employees, that's also crucial. I do know a lot of employees are going off on furlough or unemployment and not calling employers back. That is a shame, but I think you also need to outline the rules with them. So you have to give a notice if you're putting them on furlough with an intended return to work date. And then I've been adding in this paperwork that we expect to communicate with them maybe 1 or 2 weeks before the return to work date. And you're hoping to get a response from them as to whether they're coming back or not. And then if they're not showing up by the 3rd day, then they're going to be considered abandoned, and that may affect their unemployment insurance. So the way that this is working is that you have to give the employee a formal offer to come back to work. And then if you're documenting that and they say no, that should be okay in terms of PPP forgiveness. And again, you want to have all of this in writing. It's hard as an employment lawyer when people say things verbally. That doesn't really help us develop a record. So that's something you always want to do. A lot of people don't like email, so what I've done is draft letters, and I am having the business owner send it to their email and mail it to their home, and then text them that we've sent you this letter and we're asking you to respond to it. Let's see. So if you are going to be rehiring them, say they were laid off, you paid out their final paycheck and you're bringing them back, you'll be doing that onboarding paperwork as though they were a new employee. However, if they did have an I-9 in the last 3 years, you can reuse that. And then in terms of if any of their, if any of their employment documents in List B have been expired. I think if it's after March 1st, then there's some leeway there because all of the agencies are closed and people can't get a renewal. But I do recommend you go to uscis.gov, type in I-9, always get the newest form there, and then you can always look at the Q&A, and it's going to have answers to these topics. Another issue that is a hot topic, probably the #1 issue, is people not wanting to return to work because they're making more money on unemployment. And in California, they're getting an extra $600 per pay period or per month. And that is really discouraging people from coming back. So not calling back their employers. So the way that that works is you're going to give them written notice that they can come back. And if they decline, we do want to find out why. If it's some reason that they need an accommodation, we would want to have a reasonable accommodation discussion. If there's a way we can assist them with teleworking, that's something we would want to explore and put that in a policy in writing. And then we would also want to find out if they have general fears about coming back to work. So you may, again, want to implement your safety procedures, email that to them. We have been creating return to work addenda to the employee handbook, and that has about 20 different topics ranging from staggering breaks, using break rooms, telecommuting, different policies. And you can send that to them. So if they're just saying, you know, I don't want to come back to work because I'm making more money on unemployment, then you would say, okay, thank you, we're going to have to terminate you. And then when the EDD does ask about moving forward, you would say they've been terminated as of this date. So this is the prickly situation that is evolving as we move forward, but it seems to be one of the most common topics. And so here Jenny has a slide about evaluating your existing policies. So look at sick leave, paid time off. That FFCRA is in effect until the end of 2020. So just because we think COVID might be wrapping up, that is still available, and there are lawsuits about that being done incorrectly. And I find that all of these different leave laws are very complicated, so you want to speak with a qualified attorney to make sure that you're doing that correctly. As to telecommuting or work from home policies, I've seen a survey that over 50% of workers would choose to keep the telecommuting arrangement if they could. So this is something that we do have to address as a real way of the future. And so I recommend writing a telecommuting policy, and it's going to have the different rules, like how often do you have to check in? How do you communicate? What kind of home office do you need? Because you still need to have a quiet place where you can take meetings, make phone calls. And I do know right now people do have childcare, but that needs to be worked out how you can do that. And then we also recommend that employers take or ask for photographs of the workplace, because there are workers' compensation claims that arise even though the person's working from home. And so you want to say, we've looked over it, we've talked about it, and maybe that hazard wasn't there when we began the relationship. Also, very important to consider reimbursement policies. That's something that has been in California since 2016. I'm still not sure that everybody has gotten that right or made that part of their policy. And so that means under the labor code, you must reimburse an employee for any reasonable business expenses incurred within the scope of employment. So if somebody is a cashier at your business, probably they're not going to need to use their cell phone in the context of employment, but if they're working from home or if they're traveling around, probably they're using their cell phone. Now they're probably using internet connection. And so you would figure out what percentage of their bill is used for work purposes. And then you would use that as a reimbursement on their wage statement. And you'd want to have that recorded there. So expect to see class actions and lawsuits for people that aren't doing that. There is no official guidance, even years later, on how much you have to do that. So it has to be an agreement between you and the employee and something that you're both comfortable with. $5 is certainly better than zero and a lawsuit. So if you haven't done that yet, get that going. Next would be travel policies, deciding if we want to have things still remote, using Zoom, maybe making travel optional. Different things like that. You would discuss policies. I've even heard of people still using Zoom, even if they are in the back in the office, just to prohibit having too many people in close quarters. So employee job descriptions, you want to also revise because you may have laid people off or terminated people. You may be reassigning certain tasks. Maybe people can't do certain things once they're at home. So this is a good time now, especially if you do have downtime. It's a fantastic time to get all of these policies in place, and you'd want to update the job description, make sure everybody understands their new role and have them sign off on that. Also, you would want to put what are some essential functions of the job. So if this is a job that needs to be performed in person, you'd want to have that in the job description, and that may affect whether they can telecommute. And so I also recommend a telecommuting request form, and that's where the employee would say, I choose to, I'm requesting to work from home. Here's the reasons why, here's the benefits to the company. And then the company ultimately has the discretion whether to say yes or no. And so keeping in mind that working from home is a privilege, not a right, and that can be taken away at any time. And then training requirements, we want to make sure that we have our supervisors trained on a lot of the nuances that are going to come out of this, that they know what to look for if there's any accommodations we need to make. Definitely the safety policies, those are things that HR and the safety task force should be aware of. And then another thing to keep in mind is that in California, they have now said that unemployment insurance is going to be, it's going to be presumed that an infection occurred in the workplace. So whether that is fair or not, true or not, that is the new law. And the point is so that employees can be protected. So what can an employer do? Again, you're going to want to refer to the policies that you are sending out, and you may want to use e-signature document signing options or an online HR portal. That is a great way to get these things out, and that way people don't have to deal with scanners and mailing things back. That's certainly an option. But I also recommend taking photos of the area. So if you're saying we have hand sanitizer throughout the office, if we are putting tape on the floor saying you can only stand 6 feet apart when you're in line to check in at the time clock, or maybe allowing time clocks to be from your phone or your computer, or enforcing masks. You may want to show people on the assembly line all wearing masks and standing 6 feet apart. So you can say, look, we did everything possible in our realm to prevent any COVID in the workplace. Let's see. So, and from what I've heard, Walmart is currently in the middle of a lawsuit from an employee who the decedent died after being, they say, exposed in the workplace because apparently someone else had exposure and everyone wasn't notified of that. So that is currently ongoing. So it's real. If you're not sure, look at OSHA. They have all sorts of guidance there. Look at the CDC, and then even look into a consultant for workplace safety to help with that. And then time clocks, you may want to also put like a saran wrap or cover over that. Sometimes when you go to the store and you have to pay with your credit card, I'm surprised things are still not yet touchless. So you want to keep everything clean, have a cleaning schedule, maybe every 30 minutes, every 60 minutes, have a log and keep that, save it in a secure place so that you can show that you've been doing all of these things. All right, so if anyone does have any questions by what we've talked about so far, please feel free to put it in the chat. And Jenny, do you have any other topics you want to talk about today?
Yeah, I do. So there's topic number 9 in the 9 issues to consider. But before we move on, I want to expand on the topic of expense reimbursement policies from a tax perspective. Internal Revenue Code Section 139 allows the business owners to provide reimbursements to employees for qualified disaster relief expenses in connection with COVID-19. And some reimbursements that an employer provides is not includable in the employee's income and actually deductible for an employer. These expenses actually can include medical expenses, childcare expenses, expenses incurred as a result of the employee working from home, like increased utilities or expenses to set up at a home office. And although a written expense policy is not required for the benefit of qualified disaster relief payment, it's a good idea for a business owner to still enact one that's written so that they can clearly delineate and communicate to the employee what type of expenses are permissible, so that it makes it easier for the business owner to get those deductions later on, because we're all going to be cash strapped, and so we want to be able to capture as much net revenue as possible later on. So moving into the final topic of the issues for business owners to consider in reopening is for them to develop a social distancing policy and to actually enforce it. This is actually completely new, and as a result of COVID-19. And in creating an actual social distancing policy, the policy should consider training from top level all the way to the rank and file employees on their responsibilities. And those training responsibilities should include scheduling measures in terms of how much physical interaction should be done. The policy should include limits on public gatherings and emphasis on the physical distance required for public gatherings. And the policy should actually expressly prohibit physical contact like handshakes, for example. And the distancing policy should also expressly include that they're restricting workplace access to non-essential workers, and down to the specifics of prohibiting use of shared electronic or other equipment like staplers as well. If shared equipment is necessary, then the policy should establish expectations. So Jennifer earlier mentioned that there are keypads, for example. In the office, there could be copiers that is shared equipment. And so there should be a mini procedure about requiring the employee to clean their hands and clean up the copier before and after use. In the policy, it should establish monitoring compliance measures and documenting that social distancing is being monitored, and go as far as encouraging employees to self-regulate and facilitate the measures as well. And you want to communicate to the employees that the social distancing policy, just like any other policy, can be subject to disciplinary measures, just like any other policy for physical contact. So that's the last topic I wanted to talk to you about in the reopening roadmap. And as we examine the variety of government roadmaps that a business owner has to comply to at the federal, state, county, and even city level, we could see that it can definitely be overwhelming. So again, use this PowerPoint presentation as your checklist, and don't stop there. Part of the spirit of collaboration and service, what I've done in this presentation is I've actually collected a series of links that you'll be able to have access to. And so this PowerPoint presentation would end up being emailed to you all. And so what you can do is you can click on the resources and go ahead and dive a little bit deeper and figure out as the rules may be applied with your specific business as well. So this concludes my part of the presentation about 9 steps that a business owner should consider before reopening. And I'm going to open myself up to questions to the floor. I think that there are some questions that are posed in the chat.
So we do have a question for Jenny, and it was saying that these different stages seem to be based on the progress of decreases in cases and deaths. And so what are the likely time frames of the next stages, like getting to 3 and 4, Again, that does seem to be at a state and local level. So what information do you have on that?
Yeah, I'm going to say I have no guidance on that. And the reason being is that is a scientific analysis as opposed to a legal one. And I suspect that if we are able to successfully manage phase 1 and 2, then phase 3 and 4 would actually be a lot faster. So I'm going to go back for a second. I apologize. I'm just going to go back to the phases so that we can look at it together as I'm talking. And if you look at the phases, so much of being able to operate is at that planning level. And the more effort and time is put at the planning level and the application of that in phase 2, what I do anticipate is that because of the amount of time that we spend in phase 1 and 2, that stage 3 in and of itself could be faster to accomplish, because hopefully by the time that we get to phase 3, the issues that business owners are trying to deal with, and from a regulatory perspective, that they're now able to acutely determine would be able to work itself out. And so that when it gets to stage 3, by that time, the guidance hopefully can be standardized, right? And not only that, but a little bit more routine. So I predict, like many regulations, that the stage 1 and 2 is going to be the longest, and hopefully stage 3 is going to be relatively short. And if it's working, then there would be no reversion back to stage 2. But I would imagine that stage 3 is going to be hopefully quick, because the threshold is about whether there has been no infections for a series of days. But yeah, so I probably didn't answer that question, but that's just my general, very uneducated opinion on timing.
For that one, I say stay tuned, because I think citywide, countywide, statewide, federal, it's all different. So Texas has started reopening. Then you see blogs saying that they have had greater increase, although within 2-week period, we can't conclusively say whether that happened after the reopening or if those were kind of already on the way happening. I've seen emails from Garcetti or Newsom in California saying maybe we'll get to stage 3 sooner than we thought. Then there's always the possibility of, yes, reverting back to a prior stage. I read today that in China, they are having a big outbreak there, and so they're on lockdown, and it's in a different area than the province where Wuhan is. So I feel like this is so fluid, and this will be changing. I do feel like from a personal perspective, there's a lot more people interested in starting business that have contacted me. Last night, I went out and saw a lot of families in a local area in my town. So I think people are getting fatigued for sure, but hopefully we can keep the progress, wear the masks. I'm not sure that whole debate and debacle why that's the number one issue that we're having right now. I just they kind of follow the rules, and then like the sooner we can bring this down, the sooner we can keep moving forward to reopening.
Right, right. And what I encourage business owners to focus on is not necessarily on the phases, but really how to monopolize on the existing phase. In one sense, for your specific industry, everybody else is subject to the same regulations. And so now that you know what the regulations are and the risk of reversion, whatever that is, how do you monopolize from your service model on that?
And the
And
one, yeah, interesting thing that's come out of this is how enterprising people can be. So I guess always exciting things and innovations take place in challenging times. But right now for restaurants, a lot of cities are closing down city blocks so that you can create seating outside. So that is encouraging restaurants having to-go kits, different things like that. So it's a good time for you to distinguish and be creative, whatever your industry might be, and see if there are things that you could do and kind of keep your name out there so that when it does come back, people are there and ready to patronize you if they haven't, or to keep doing so in the meantime.
right, right. And as we examine the law in permitting the end of the stay-at-home order versus the actual risk of contracting COVID-19 even after the stay-at-home order is lifted, whether individuals are just transacting business differently. So that's why I encourage business owners to examine how is it that they can monopolize in the regulations that are imposed today, and sort of project out, regardless of the stay-at-home order, how are they going to be able to monopolize their business going forward, and kind of presume that even after the lift, there would still be a number of people who may independently decide that they're still going to continue the social distancing measures.
Mhm. And I feel like the authorities don't even know the answer to this. So this is something that you're just going to have to keep monitoring, and we'll be hoping for the best on that. So we do have one other question about the expense reimbursements. And so this is if now we have employees telecommuting from home and they have internet costs, how much would they reimburse for? Does it have to be the whole monthly cost, or can they establish an allowance? And so part of the case law that came out of this whole thing was that the employers cannot get a windfall. For example, if someone has, for example, unlimited minutes on their cell phone plan. So again, what I recommend would be to look at what percentage of the time. So if they're working 5 days a week or 40 hours a week, you may divide that out of 7 days a week, figure out what that would be, take a look at their bill and reimburse them for that. Or you can have that amount taken out monthly, and then if there are changes, for example, they're using it more, then I would up that. That's probably the best option that you can do. And so maybe you could say for the average employee working 40 hours a week, we will reimburse 50% of your bill, or come up with something that you want to have, either a standard policy for the company, and then you can issue that, something that's going to be fair or proportional to the use. If it's a part-time employee, obviously that amount might be less, or you can have them give you their bill every month, and then you can take a look at it and figure that out. But that's certainly going to be more bookkeeping. So I would say figure out as a company what's best for you and what is most fair to the employees, and stick with that, and then always be available to increase the amount if their usage increased as well.
Right. And I would encourage business owners, of course, to contact their CPA to do a deeper look about what that deduction would look like in terms of their revenue.
And then also contact your payroll company. Again, I've mentioned before, if you are still doing payroll yourself, now's the time to get a payroll company that does know what they're doing and can help you. For example, some even help with PPP, loan forgiveness tracking, and things like that. So that's something that you do want to put on the wage statement as a reimbursement expense. And so then someone asked if this is going to be retroactive. I mean, this law has been in place in California for 4 years now. So technically, someone could bring a lawsuit and ask for that to be retroactive. So you can decide whether you want to even have a settlement agreement where you're going to pay them out for back pay. I don't know how many people would actually do that, but it is a thought. So if you're not doing it, at least you can start from today and reduce that liability going forward. All right, so any other thoughts or questions or comments?
Yeah, it looks like there are more questions with respect to expense reimbursement, and we can just be clear. I think the question is whether retroactive internet reimbursement is permissible. So the key here with the Section 139 qualified disaster relief payment is that these reimbursements or costs incurred by the employee in the variety of categories are as a result of COVID-19, right? And so if we examine when the shelter in place order got issued, at least in Orange County on March 16th, we can definitively determine that that was the date that the pandemic could have impacted the employee. I personally think that it could be earlier because it was a variety of counties. For example, San Francisco and San Diego County actually issued a state of emergency as well. So when you examine the retroactiveness, if you can look at the facts that gives rise to the expenditure incurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, then that probably is the time period in which reimbursable expenses could be incurred and reimbursed and paid out from the employer to the employee.
And then in terms of the PPP loan forgiveness, if this was already something you had in place before February 15th, which is when they did all the analysis of how much to give you for your loan, and you had this policy in place, and this is something that's actually run through payroll, then it's something that could conceivably be forgiven. Another question, just to keep on this topic, is does this reimbursement need to include internet costs, electricity, and phone? And do you need to identify those separately? So under the Labor Code 2802, you can look that up on, just put that in Google, or I can email it to you. It's basically for any expenses reasonably incurred within the scope of employment. And so I have been to several seminars on this topic, and nobody had a definitive answer on internet and electricity. But I would think now that if people are working from home, they're going to be at home 40 hours more than they would be in the office. So conceivably, you could say this is an additional burden that I didn't have before when I was at the office. So if you want to be conservative and proactive, you could include that. Again, you'd have to look at the percent of their bill, how many hours per week they're actually using these, and then put that on the wage statement. And then if you do want to be very active in your record keeping, maybe itemize how all of them, or have an agreement that says I will reimburse you for electricity, internet, and phone, and the total amount is this, and if there's any changes, let us know. And so definitely I can see phone if they're on phone calls, if they're using internet. I just really feel anything that they're using now that they wouldn't have if they were in the office is probably the best way to look at that.
Right, right. So as an additional resource for everyone who has registered for this webinar, what I'll do is I'll send out the slide deck, and I'll also send you a specific write-up on Internal Revenue Code Section 139 so that you can have specific guidance on the categories and take the time to figure out at which time can the employee make the reimbursements and for what amount and what is not covered. So you'll have that in front of you.
And I do have an article on the cell phone reimbursement that I've updated about 3 times since 2016, and again for COVID. That's at gradyfirm.com. If you go on the blog under resources, you can search the topics, and then we also have a COVID page that you can access from the homepage, or resources, and we're putting daily posts there, all these videos that we're doing and all the articles that we're publishing every week.
So I think that concludes our presentation. Want to make sure we don't take up your entire lunch hour. My name is Jenny Tran. I'm a business and tax planning attorney at Brown and Streza. We'll reach out to you after this presentation, and you're welcome to reach out to us if you have questions. Jennifer?
All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope this has been helpful. It's been a pleasure speaking with you all on a weekly or every other week basis, and keep it up. I know it's been trying times, but I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But don't use this as an opportunity to let things go by. Now is the time for employers more than ever to ramp up their record keeping, ramp up their policies, and make sure that you're following the constant barrage of updates and changes in the law, and then reach out to your service providers. We're here to help you write any of these policies that you need and answer your questions. So thanks for attending.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.